What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today we're going to be taking a look at this Frank Turek video where apparently he says that the New Testament is definitely reliable enough to give us information about Jesus. As we all know, that's bullshit. But today we're going to find out why that's bullshit, and if you're interested in this, then please stay tuned.
Another thing that you mentioned too is they started writing down Revelation or whatever, or not Revelation, but they were writing down the New Testament.
Right.
But from my understanding, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John started writing many years after the ascension of Jesus. You know, when a crime is taking place, you know, whenever there are witnesses, they want the witnesses to come, you know, at hand as soon as possible, because over time you forget things, you know, certain things start to, you know, come more addition into your memory, you know, you start losing things, there's holes in your story. So do you feel like, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80 years after the ascension of Jesus, the New Testament writings were compiled in, I think it was at 320 or 350 AD?
Oh, no. You're talking about when church councils came together.
Well, that's what I mean, like Constantine, the compilation of the Bible.
No, Constantine had nothing to do with what was in the Bible.
Now, I do have to somewhat agree with Frank Turek here, because by the time that the Council of Nicaea and all the other councils were convened, the Bible was already, like, compiled into a book. They were really just discussing theology and some theological matters surrounding what was already in the book. What we know of as the canon, I guess, of the Bible, not like the actual words in the canon, but just like the books that compose the canon, were most likely compiled in the mid-2nd century. Now, to answer this guy's question on the quality of evidence, because he compared it to some kind of crime that happened and eyewitnesses writing down their information directly after the events occurred. While that is the best way to get the most accurate version of events from an eyewitness, we oftentimes don't have that in history. Things being written down as close to the events that happened is really what we're hoping to get. But that also doesn't work in favor for Christianity, because with the New Testament, the earliest writer you have is Paul, and Paul doesn't really admit that Jesus walked on earth, just that he had visions and he read scriptures about Jesus, and that is the only way that he came to know this Jesus character. With that being the earliest source in the New Testament for Jesus, it really doesn't help the historicity of Jesus or the resurrection, because Paul never places it here on earth, and that is our earliest witness for these supposed events, who never actually saw the events occur.
The point is that the New Testament documents were written down in the 1st century within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, because most of them were eyewitnesses.
This is false. The eyewitnesses did not write down anything. If there were eyewitnesses at all, they would have been illiterate, and they would have been uneducated, and they would have been unable to write these things down. So the best that you could really hope for is some kind of oral history that was later written down by somebody that was educated, like Paul. But again, like I said, Paul vehemently denies getting his information from any, person here on earth, and that he only got it from revelation of Jesus and through the scriptures. The scriptures, he got it from there because supposedly that was written down by God, or at least it was God inspired. Those are God's words. So he felt like he could trust that source. The Gospels were written by anonymous authors. Not even the Gospels name who authored them. It isn't until the 2nd century that we get names for the Gospels. I think generally people cite Papias as naming the Gospels, but he is a very unreliable source. There's nothing within the Gospels that indicate that they were written by eyewitnesses, especially with the fact that Mark is our earliest Gospel, written in the 70s. Now that's right there at the tail end of any eyewitness actually living. If you consider the eyewitnesses' most likely life span, they would have most definitely died before that point. But a more important fact is that Mark, our earliest Gospel, like I said, written in 70 AD, that Gospel never cites a human source as its, information. The only thing that it ever cites is the scriptures, which is exactly what Paul was doing. Paul was citing scriptures and revelation. The difference, though, with the Mark gospel is the fact that there are no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, if you take the original ending. If you include the ending that was later tacked on, most likely in the 2nd century, then there are post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. But we know that to be a later addition to Mark. So, basic takeaway here is that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. I didn't mention this before, but the Matthew, Luke, and John Gospels, they were all most likely influenced by Mark, if not Paul as well. Definitely Matthew and Luke because they directly copy from Mark. John was written at the very end of the 1st century, and so he already had all of this material from which to pull.
And so I think you can show that beyond any reasonable doubt. I couldn't go through all the data here, but even elements of the New Testament, like 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, which is an ancient creed that tells you what Jesus did, that he actually rose from the dead and he appeared to many people, including over 500, who Paul says many are still alive, but some have died. That creed right there, even atheist scholars agree, goes all the way back to the resurrection itself, between months to, say, 3 years after the resurrection. That creed is too early to be legendary. And that creed finds its way into 1 Corinthians in 55 AD when Paul writes it. But it existed long prior to that, as even people like Bart Ehrman, who, as you know, is an atheist who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's not a fan of Christianity, but he says, look, that creed is early. Very early.
Okay, so first off, Bart Ehrman is an agnostic, not an atheist. He doesn't use that label. He doesn't consider himself an atheist. So it would kind of behoove you not to label him as an atheist, but rather an agnostic. Second, I disagree with the use of the appeal to authority here, being that he says that, even atheist scholars agree that this particular thing dates back to just after the resurrection, which in reality, the actual consensus is that it dates back to right when Jesus died, or like a few months or maybe a year or so after Jesus supposedly died. That's technically what the consensus is, but just because it's the consensus doesn't mean that it's correct. I'm perfectly fine with dating this particular creed to being in the early 30s AD. Perfectly fine with that. Have no qualms about it. But if you look at the creed, what it really says, then you will find that Paul here is citing scriptures as to how he knows that these things happen. Because he says, according to the scriptures. According to the scriptures. I mean, there's even a website about according to the scriptures that shows a full list of all of the prophecies in the scriptures that are reflected in the New Testament. Regardless of whether or not Paul got his information, got this creed from an early oral tradition or whatever, that doesn't matter. Because Paul says that he never got his information from a person. That's the only thing that he could ever claim, is that he didn't get it from a person, he got it from Jesus. And then in the creed itself, it says according to the scriptures, which seems to denote that the scriptures are the only way that you know that these things happened. Now, with this whole 500 witnesses thing, you basically just have Paul saying that there's 500 witnesses. There's even a good case to be made that the 500 witnesses isn't what it was originally there, that it was originally something else. But regardless of that particular case, it's still just Paul saying that Jesus appeared to 500 people. The mere belief that that happened is what is proven by this creed. Not that it actually happened, just that Paul has the mere belief that it did.
So you have data that is later written down in the New Testament that's very, very early. It might be like if you interviewed somebody who was there 20 years ago and gives you all this data that they have from 20 years, and then you put it in the letter you're writing. That's still good data from 20 years ago. Just because you write it now doesn't make it 20 years old.
Yeah. It's
still coming from the source, and that's the kind of stuff you have in the New Testament. In fact, Gary Habermas at Liberty University has identified 41 creeds in the New Testament. That's probably the most famous one, 1 Corinthians 15.
But still, that doesn't make it actual history. Just because you can date it early doesn't mean that that's like good history or that it actually happened. Also, as we learn more about the human memory, we find that eyewitness testimony gets more unreliable as time goes on. So while you could interview a witness about something that happened 20 years ago, you're most likely not going to get the best version of the events. And in some cases, you could get false information mixed in with it because of how our human mind works. That's why getting the earliest version of events is generally considered to be the most accurate version of events. It's still fresh in your mind, and you can accurately recall what has actually happened. But that's not the case for the Gospels, even with Paul, because Paul wasn't actually there. He didn't know anybody that was actually there, as far as we know, because he never specifies any disciples. He never specifies anybody in the Gospels, which I know that he talks to Cephas, who is Peter in the Gospels. But if my idea is correct, then Paul talking about Cephas and then later Gospel writers using that in order to generate their Gospels is very plausible and is much more likely, considering the background evidence that we have. So in summary, no, the New Testament Gospels do not give us reliable information about the actual Jesus that could have existed in the 30s AD. There's no way the Gospels could do it because they were written over 40 years after he supposedly died. Paul never admits to Jesus being on earth. He only talks about a celestial Jesus appearing to him, giving him revelation through which he gained his knowledge about Jesus and what he suffered. Paul also read the scriptures, which the suffering servant is definitely a prophecy in the scriptures. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that Jews were looking to the scriptures for information about the Messiah. If you want to learn more about that, you can look up Philo of Alexandria. Or you could just download my Crestus app, where you can get peer-reviewed scholarship on the historicity of Jesus and early Christianity. Just visit crest.us and you'll be able to find out more information. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I really appreciate you guys hanging around, listening to me talk about history once again. If you will, go down below and leave me your thoughts about Frank Turek and what he said in this video. While you're down there, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to check out these links over here, and I hope that you guys will stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.